In addressing myself, gentlemen, to the consideration of a question which has excited so much interest and elicited so much discussion at the present day as that of university education, I feel some explanation is due from me for supposing, after such high ability and wide experience have been brought to bear upon it, that any field remains for the additional labours either of a disputant or of an inquirer. If nevertheless I still venture to ask permission to continue the discussion, already so protracted, it is because the subject of liberal education, and of the principles on which it must be conducted, has ever had a hold upon my own mind, and because I have lived the greater part of my life in a place which has all that time been occupied in a series of controversies both domestic and with strangers, and of all measures, experimental or definitive, bearing upon it. About 50 years since, the English University of which I was so long a member, after a century of inactivity, at length was roused, at a time when, as I may say, it was given no education at all to the youth committed to its keeping, to a sense of the responsibilities which its profession and its station involved, and it presents to us a singular example of a heterogeneous and independent body of men setting about a work of self-reformation, not from any pressure of public opinion, but because it was fitting and right to undertake it. Its initial efforts, begun and carried on amid many obstacles, were met from without, as often happens in such cases, by ungenerous and jealous criticisms, which, at the very moment that they were urged, were beginning to be unjust. Controversy did but bring out more clearly to its own apprehension the views on which its reformation was proceeding, and throw them into a philosophical form. The course of beneficial change made progress, and what was at first but the result of individual energy of beneficial change made progress, and what was at first but the result of individual energy and an act of the academical corporation gradually became more popular, and was taken up and carried out by the separate collegiate bodies of which the university is composed. This was the first stage of the controversy. Years passed away, and then political adversaries arose against it, and the system of education which had been established was a second time assailed. But still, since that contest was conducted for the most part through the medium not of political acts but of treaties and pamphlets, it happened as before that the threatened dangers in the course of their repulse did but afford fuller development and more exact delineation to the principles to which the university was a representative. In the former of these two controversies, the charge brought against its studies was the remoteness from the occupations and the duties of life to which they are the formal introduction, or in other words, their inutility in the latter. It was their connection with a particular form of belief, or in other words, their religious exclusiveness. Living so long as a witness, though hardly as an actor in these scenes of intellectual conflict, I am able to bear witness to views of university education, without authority indeed in themselves, but not without value to a Catholic and less familiar to him, as I conceive, than they deserve to be. And while an argument originating in the controversies to which I have referred may be serviceable at this season to that a great cause in which we are here so specially interested, to me personally it will afford satisfaction of a particular kind, for though it has been my lot for many years to take a prominent, sometimes a presumptuous part in theological discussions, yet the natural turn of my mind carries me off to the trains of thought like those which I am about now to open, which, important though they may be for Catholic objects, and admitting of a Catholic treatment, are sheltered from the extreme delicacy and peril without, and admitting to a Catholic treatment, are sheltered from the extreme delicacy and peril which attach to disputations directly bearing on the subject matter of divine revelation. There are several reasons why I should open a discussion with a reference to the lessons with which past years have supplied me. One reason is this. It would concern me, gentlemen, were I supposed to have got up my opinions for the occasion. This indeed would have been no reflection on me personally, supposing I were persuaded of their truth, when at length addressing myself to the inquiry. But it would seem to have destroyed, of course, the force of my testimony, and deprived such arguments as I might adduce of that moral persuasiveness that attends on tried and sustained conviction. It would have made me seem the advocate rather than the cordial and deliberate maintainer and witness of the doctrines which I was to support, and though it might be said to evidence the faith I reposed in the practical judgment of the Church, and the intimate concurrence of my own reason with the course she had authoritatively sanctioned, and with the devotion with which I could promptly put myself at her disposal, it would have cast suspicion on the validity of reasonings and conclusions which rested on no independent inquiry and appealed to no past experience. In that case it might have been plausibly objected by opponents that I was the servile expedient of an emergency, and never after all could I be more ingenious and adroit in the management of an argument which was not my own, and to which I was to forget again as I readily had mastered it. But this is not so. The views to which I have referred have grown into my whole system of thought, and are, as it were, part of myself. Many changes has my mind gone through. Here it has known no variation or vacillation of opinion, and though this is by itself no proof of the truth of my principles, it puts a seal upon conviction, and is a justification of earnestness and zeal. These principles, which I now set forth under the sanction of the Catholic Church, were my profession, when religion was to me more a matter of feeling and experience than of faith. They did but take a greater hold upon me, as I was introduced to the records of Christian antiquity, and approached in sentiment and desire to Catholicism, and my sense of their correctness has been increased with the events every year I have brought within its pale. And here I am brought to a second and more important reason for referring on this occasion to the conclusions at which Protestants have arrived on the subject of liberal education, and it is as follows. Let it be observed then that the principles on which I would conduct the inquiry are attainable, as I have already implied, by the mere experience of life. They do not come simply of theology, they imply no supernatural discernment, they have no special connection with revelation, they almost arise out of the nature of the case. They are dictated even by human prudence and wisdom, through a divine illumination to be absent, and they are recognised by common sense, even where self-interest is not present to quicken it. They do not come simply of theology, they imply no supernatural discernment, they have no special connection with revelation, they almost arise out of the nature of the case. They are dictated even by human prudence and wisdom, through a divine illumination be absent, and they are recognised by common sense, even where self-interest is not present to quicken it, and therefore, though true and just and good in themselves, they imply nothing whatsoever as be the religious profession of those who maintain them. They may be held by Protestants as well as by Catholics, nay, there is reason to anticipate that in certain times and places they will be more thoroughly investigated and better understood and held more firmly by Protestants than by ourselves. It is natural to expect this form from the very circumstances that the philosopher of education is founded on truths in the natural order. Where the sun shines bright in the warm climate of the south, the natives of the place know little of the safeguards against cold and wet. They have indeed bleak and piercing blasts. They have chill and pouring rain, but only now and then for a day or a week they bear the inconvenience as they best may. But they have not made it an art to repel it. It is not worth their while. The science of calefration and ventilation is reserved for the north. It is in this way that Catholics stand relatively to Protestants in the science of education. Protestants, depending on human means mainly, are led to make the most of them. Their sole resource is to use what they have. Knowledge is their power, and nothing else. They are in the anxious cultivators of a good rugged soil. It is otherwise with us. We have a godly inheritance. It is apt to cause us, but I do not mean to rely too much on prayer and the divine blessing, for it is impossible. But we sometimes forget that we shall please him best and get most from him when, according to the fable, we put our shoulder to the wheel. When we use what we have by nature to the utmost, and at the same time we look out for what is beyond nature in the confidence of faith and hope. However, we are sometimes tempted to let certain things take their course as if they would in no way turn up right, at least for a certain. However, we are sometimes tempted to let certain things take their course, as if they would in one way or another turn up right, at last for certain. And so we go on, living from hand to mouth, getting into difficulties and getting out of them, succeeding certainly on the whole, but with failure in detail which might be avoided, and with much of imperfection or inferiority in our appointments and plans, and much disappointment, discouragement, and collision of opinion in consequence. If it be of any measure the state of the case, there is certainly so far a reason for availing ourselves of the investigations and experiences of those who are not Catholics when we have to address them ourselves to the subject of liberal education. Nor is there surely any derogatory to the position of a Catholic in such a proceeding. The Church has never appealed and deferred to witnesses and authorities external to herself in those matters in which she has thought had means of forming a judgment, and on that principle, Cinque in art credonium, she has made and used unbelievers and pagans in evidence of her truth, as far as their testimony went. She avails herself of scholars, critics, and antiquarians. She has worded her theological teaching in the phraseology of Aristotle, Aquila, Simantius, Theodotion, Origen, Eusebius, and Apollinaris. All more or less heterodox, have supplied materials for primitive exegesis. Saint Cyprian called Tertullian his master. Saint Augustine refers to Tychonius. Bossuet in modern times complimented the labours of the Anglican bull. The Benedictine editors of the Fathers are familiar with the labours of Fell, Usher, Pearson and Beveridge. Pope Benedict XIV cites, according to the occasion, the words of Protestants without reserve, and the late French collection of Christian apologists contains the writings of Locke, Burnet, Tillotson and Paley. If then I come forward in any degree as borrowing the views of certain Protestant schools on the point which is to be discussed, I do so, gentlemen, as believing first that the Catholic Church has ever, in the plenitude of her divine illumination, made use of whatever truth or wisdom she has found in their teaching or in their measures, and next in that particular places or times her children are likely to profit from external suggestions or lessons which have not been provided for them by herself. And here I may mention a third reason for appealing at the outset to the proceeding of Protestant bodies in regard to liberal education. It will serve to intimate the mode in which I may propose to handle my subject altogether. Observe then, gentlemen, I have no intention in anything I say of bringing into the argument the authority of the Church, or any authority at all, but I shall consider the question simply on the grounds of human reason and human wisdom. I am investigating the abstract, and I am determining what is in itself right and true. For the moment I know nothing, so to say, of history. I take these things as I find them. I have no concern with the past. I find myself here. I set myself to the duties I find here. I set myself to further, by every means in my power, doctrines and views, true in themselves, recognised by Catholics as such, familiar to my own mind, and to do this quite apart from considerations of questions which have been determined without me and before me. I am the advocate and a minister of a certain great principle, yet not merely advocate and minister, else had I not been here at all. It has been my previous keen sense and hearty reception of that principle that this has been at once the reason, as I must suppose, of being selected for this office, and it is the cause of my accepting it. I am told on authority that a principle is expedient, which means I have ever felt it to be true, and I argue on its behalf on its own merits, the authority which brings me here being my opportunity for arguing, but not the ground of my argument itself. And a fourth reason here suggested for consulting the history of Protestant institutions when I'm going to speak to you on the object and nature of university education. And a fourth reason here suggested for consulting the history of Protestant institutions when I'm going to speak on the object and nature of university education. It will serve to remind you, gentlemen, that I am concerned with questions, not simply of immutable truth, but of practice and expedience. It would ill have come upon me to undertake such a subject on which points of dispute have arisen among persons so far above me in authority and name in relation to a state of society about which I have so much to learn, if it involved an appeal to sacred truths or to the determination of some imperative rule of conduct. It would have been presumptuous in me to have acted, nor am I acting. Even the question of the union of theology with the secular sciences, which is the religious side, simply is of a solution in the abstract, has, accordingly to difference of circumstances, been at different times differently decided. Necessity has no law, and expedience is often one form of necessity. It is no principle with sensible men of whatever cast of opinion to do also what is abstractly best. Where no direct duty forbids, we may be obliged to, as being best under circumstances, what we murmur and rise against while we do it. We see that to attempt more is to effect less, that we must accept so much or gain nothing, and so perforce we reconcile ourselves to what we would have far otherwise if we could. Such a system of what is called secular education, in which theology and the sciences are taught separately, may in a particular place or time be the least of evils. It may be of a long standing, it may be dangerous to meddle with, it may be professedly a temporary arrangement, it may be under a process of improvement, it has disadvantages, may be neutralized by the persons by whom of the provisions under which it is administered. Hence it was in the early ages of the Church allowed her children to attend the heathen schools for the acquisition of secular accomplishments, where, as no one can doubt, evils existed, at least as great as you can attend on mixed education now. The gravest fathers recommended for Christian youth the use of pagan masters. The most saintly bishops and most authoritative doctors have been sent in their adolescence by Christian parents to pagan lecture halls, and not to take other instances at this very time and in this very country as regards the poorer classes of the community, whose secular requirements must be limited, it has seemed best to the Irish bishops under the circumstances to suffer the introduction in the country of a system of mixed educations in the school called national. Such a state of things, however, is passing away as regards university education at least. The highest authority has now decided that the plan, which is abstractly best, is in this time and this country most expedient. And here I have an opportunity of recognising once for all a higher view of approaching the subject of these discourses, which after this formal recognition I mean to dispense with. Ecclesiastical authority, not argument, is a supreme role and the appropriate guide for Catholics in matter of religion. It has always been the right to interpose, and sometimes in conflict of parties and opinions, it is called on to exercise that right. It has been lately exercised in our own instance. It has been interposed in favour of a pure university system for Catholic youth, forbidding compromise or accommodation of any kind. Of course, this decision must be heartily accepted and obeyed, and more because the decision proceeds not simply from the bishops of Ireland, great as their authority is, but the highest authority on earth, from the chair of St. Peter. Moreover, such a decision not only demands our submission, but also a claim upon our trust. It not only acts as a prohibition of any measures, but as an ipso facto confutation of any reasonings inconsistent with it. It carries with it an earnest and an augury of its own expediency. For instance, I fancy, gentlemen, there may be some among those who hear me disposed to say that they are ready to acquit the principles of education which I am to advocate for all fault whatsoever except that of being impracticable. I can fancy them granting to me those principles are most correct and most obvious, simply irresistible on paper, but maintaining nevertheless, after all, They are nothing more than the dreams of men who live out of the world, and who do not see the difficulty in keeping Catholicism anyhow afloat on the bosom of this wonderful 19th century. Proved indeed though those principles are to demonstration, but they will not work. Nay, it was my own omission just now that in a particular instance it might easily happen. But that is only second best. That what is only second best is best practically, because what is actually best is out of the question. This, I hear you say to yourselves, is the state of things at present. You recount in every detail the numberless impediments, great and small, formidable or only vexatious, in which every step embarrassed the attempt to carry out, ever so poorly, a principle in itself so true and ecclesiastical. You appeal in your defence to wise and sacrist intellectuals who are far from enemies to Catholicism or to the Irish hierarchy, and you have no hope, or rather you absolutely disbelieve, that education can possibly be conducted here and now on a theological principle, or that youths of different religions can, under the circumstances of the country, be educated apart from each other. The more you think over the state of politics, the position of parties, the feelings of classes, and the experience of the past, the more chimerial does it appear to you to aim at a university of which Catholicity is the fundamental principle. Nay, even if the attempt could accidentally succeed, would not the mischief exceed the benefit of it? Now, great many sacrifices, in how many ways by which we would be preceded and followed, how many wounds, open and secret, would it afflict upon the body politic? And if it fails, which is to be expected, then a double mischief will ensue from its recognition of evils which they have been unable to remedy. These are your deep misgivings, and in proportion to the force with which they come to you, is the concern and anxiety which you feel that there should be those whom you love, whom you revere, who from one course or other refuse to enter into them. This, I repeat, is what some good Catholics will say to me, and more than this, they will express themselves better than I can speak for them in their behalf, with more earnestness and point, with more force of argument and fullness of detail, and I will frankly and at once acknowledge that I will insist on the high theological view of a university without attempting to give a direct answer to their arguments against its present practicability. I do not say an answer cannot be given. On the contrary, they have a confident expectation that in proportion to those objections are looked in the face, they will fade away. But however this may be, it would not come to me to argue the matter with those who understand the circumstances of the problem so much better than myself. What do I know of the state of things in Ireland that I should presume to put ideas of mine, which could not be right except by accident, by the side of theirs who speak in the country of their birth and their home? No, gentlemen, you are natural judges of the difficulties which beset us, and they are doubtless greater, and I can even fancy your forebode. Let me, for the sake of argument, admit all of you to say against our enterprise and a great deal more. Your proof of its intrinsic impossibility shall be to me as cogent as my own of its theological advisableness. Why then should I be so rash and perverse as to involve myself in a trouble not properly mine? Why go out of my own place? Why so headstrong and reckless as to lay up for myself miscarriage and disappointment, as though I were not having enough of personal trial anyhow, without having to go about seeking it? Reflections such as these would be decisive even with the boldest and most capable minds, but for one consideration. In the midst of our difficulties I have one ground of hope, just one stay, but I think a sufficient one, which serves me in the stead of all other judgment, whatever which hardens me against criticism, which supports me as I begin to despond, and to which I ever come round, when the question of the possible and the expedient is brought into discussion. It is the decision of the Holy See. St. Peter has spoken. It is he who has enjoined that which seems to us so unpromising. He has spoken and has claim on us to trust him. He is no recluse, no solitary student, no dreamer about the past, no doter upon the dead and gone, no projector of the visionary. He for 1800 years has lived in the world. He has seen all fortunes. He has encountered all adversaries. He has shaped himself for all emergencies. If ever there was a power on earth who had eye for the times, who has confined himself to the practicable, and has been happy in his anticipations, those words have been facts, and whose commands prophecies. Such is he in the history of ages, who sits upon generation to generation in the chair of the apostles as the vicar of Christ and the doctor of his church. These are not the words of rhetoric, gentlemen, but of history. All who take part with the apostle are on the winning side. He has long since given warrants for the confidence which he claims. From the first he has looked through the wide world of which he has set the burden, and according to the need of the day and the inspirations of his Lord, he has set upon now one thing, now to another, but to all in season and to nothing in vain. He came first upon an age of refinement and luxury like our own, and in spite of the persecutor, fertile in the resources of his cruelty, he soon gathered out of all classes of society, the slave, the soldier, the high-born lady, the sophist, materials enough to form a people to his master's honour. The savage hordes came down from torrents from the north, and Peter went out to meet them, and by his very eye he sobered them and backed them in their full career. They turned aside and flooded the whole earth, but only more surely civilized by him, and made 10 times more his children even than the older populations which they had overwhelmed. Lawless kings arose, Sancus as a Roman, passionate as a Hun. Yet in him they found their match and were shattered, and he lived on. The gates of the earth were open to the east and the west, and men poured to take possession. He went with them by his missionaries to China, to Mexico, carried out by zeal and charity as far as those children of men were led by enterprise, covetousness, or ambition. Has he failed in his successes up to this hour? Did he in our father's day fail in his struggle with Joseph of Germany and his confederates with Napoleon, a greater name, and his dependent kings, that though in another kind of fight he should fail in ours? What grey hairs are on the head of Judah, whose youth is renewed like the eagles, whose feet are like the feet of harts, and underneath the everlasting arms. In the first centuries of the Church, all this practical sagacity of Holy Church was a mere matter of faith, but every age as it has come has confirmed faith by actual sight, and shame on us if, with the accumulated testimony of 18 centuries, our eyes are too gross to see those victories which the saints have ever seen by anticipation. Least of all we, the Catholics of islands, which can in the cultivation and diffusion of knowledge heretofore be so singularly united under the auspices of the apostolic see. Least of all can we be the men to trust in its wisdom and predict its failure when it sends us on a similar mission now. I cannot forget that at a time when Celt and Saxon were alike savage, it was the see of Peter gave them both of them first faith, then civilization, and then again bound them together in one by the seal of a great commission to convert and illuminate in their turn the pagan continent. I cannot forget how it was from Rome that the glorious St. Patrick was sent to Ireland, and did a work so great that he could not have a successor in it. The sanctity and learning and zeal and charity which followed on his death being the result of one impulse which he gave. I cannot forget how in no long time, under the fostering breath of the Vicar of Christ, a country of heathen superstitions became the very wonder and asylum of all people, the wonder of its reason and knowledge, sacred and profane, and the asylum of religion, literature and science, when chased away from the continent by the barbarian invaders. I recollect its hospitality freely accorded to the pilgrim, its volumes magnificently presented to foreign student, and the prayers, the blessings, the holy rites, the solemn chants which sanctified both the giver and receiver. Nor can I forget when my own England had meanwhile become the solicitude of some unwearied eye, how Augustine was sent to us by Gregory, how he fainted in the way at the tidings of our fierceness, and, but for the Pope, would have shrunk us from the impossible expedition, how he was forced in weakness and in fear and in much trembling, until he had achieved the conquest of the island to Christ. Nor again had it come to pass that when Augustine died and his work slackened, another pope, unwearied still, sent 3 saints from Rome to ennoble and refine the people Augustine had converted. 3 holy men set out from England together, of different nations: Theodore, an Asiatic Greek from Tarsus; Adrian, an African; Bennet alone a Saxon, for Peter knows no distinction of races in his ecumenical work. They came with theology and science in their train, with relics, with pictures, with manuscripts of the Holy Fathers and the Greek classics, and Theodore and Adrian founded schools, secular and monastic, all over England, while Bennet brought to the north a very large library he had collected in foreign parts, and with plans and ornamental work from France erected a church of stone under the vocation of St. Peter after the Roman fashion, which, says the historian, he most affected. I call to mind how St. Wilfrid, St. John of Beverley, St. Bede and other saintly men carried on the good work in the following generations, and from that time forth the 2 islands, England and Ireland, in a dark and dreary age, were 2 lights of Christendom that had no claims on each other, no thought of self, save in the interchange of offices and the rivalry of love. O memorable time when St. Aidan, the Irish monks, went up to Lindisfarne and Melrose and taught the Saxon youth, and when a St. Cuthbert and St. Dieter repaid their charitable toil. O bless the days of peace and confidence when the Celtic Maelduff penetrated to Malmesbury in the south, which has inherited his name, and founded there the famous school which gave birth to the great St. Eldam. O precious seal and testimony of gospel unity when Eldam in turn tells us the English went to Ireland, numerous as bees. Then the Saxon St. Egbert and St. Willibrod, preachers to the heathen Phrygians who made the voyage to Ireland to prepare themselves for their work, and from Ireland went forth to Germany the 2 noble Ewards, Saxons also, to earn the crown of martyrdom. Such a period, indeed, so rich in grace, in peace, in love, and in good works, could only last for a season. But when light was to pass away from them, the sister islands were destined not to forfeit, but to transmit it together. The time came when the neighbouring continental country was in turn the mission from which they had exercised so long and well, and when they made it over their honourable office, faithful to the alliance of 200 years, they made a joint act. Alcuin was the pupil of both the English and Irish schools, and when Charlemagne would revive science and letters in his own France, it was Alcuin, the representative both of the Saxon and the Celt, who was the chief of those who went forth to supply the need of the great emperor. Such was the foundation of the school of Paris, from which the course of centuries sprang the famous university, the glory of the Middle Ages. The past never returns. The course of events, old in its texture, if ever, new in its colouring and fashion. England and Ireland were not what they once were, but Rome is where it was, and St. Peter is the same. His zeal, his charity, his mission, his gifts are all the same. He has of old made us the 2 islands by giving them joint work of teaching, and surely he is giving us, like a mission, that we shall become one again.